Hello and welcome to this module. Today we will provide a brief overview of the anatomy and physiology of the nervous system. The nervous system is very complex, so please be sure to use this video to supplement any reading assignments provided by your instructor. Upon completion of this learning opportunity, students will be better able to list the divisions and subdivisions of the nervous system, describe the structures involved in conduction of electrical impulses between the brain and the rest of the body, list the structures of the central nervous system and their functions, define the terms cerebral perfusion pressure and pulse pressure, describe the components of the subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system, and describe the sensory function of the nervous system, including types of pain. The nervous system is one of the more complex organ systems within our bodies. The nervous system is responsible for monitoring the internal and external environments and allowing our body to adapt as needed. Our nervous system also coordinates all voluntary and involuntary functions throughout our body. For example, we don't need to think about taking a breath once every 5 to 6 seconds or making our heart contract 80 times a minute. These things are controlled automatically by our nervous system. Conversely, if we want to get up and get a glass of sweet tea from the fridge, our nervous system coordinates with other organ systems to make this happen. Lastly, the nervous system functions to receive and interpret sensory information and create an appropriate motor response. There are two main components of the human nervous system: the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerve. Sensory nerves gather information from the body tissue via the peripheral nervous system and transmit this information to the central nervous system for processing. After processing, the central nervous system sends impulses to the body via the motor nerves. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system is divided into two sections: the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for things that we have voluntary control over, and the autonomic nervous system, which are the body functions that occur automatically or that are not under voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions: the sympathetic nervous system, that is responsible for activity response to stressful or dangerous situations, and the parasympathetic nervous system, that is responsible for conserving energy, rest, and recovery. Neurons are the fundamental elements of the nervous system. Neurons enable the transmission of impulses to and from the central nervous system. In the image on the left, we see an illustration of what a neuron looks like at the microscopic level. Neurons are composed of three parts: the dendrites, cell body, and axon. The dendrites are short, branching projections that receive impulses from nearby cells. The nucleus of the cell body is responsible for all essential cell functions, such as energy production and waste removal. The axon is another projection that takes the signal from the cell body and delivers it to the target tissues or other neurons. In the image on the right, we see a neuron conducting electrical impulses to the dendrites of a target cell. The impulse is conducted from the axon terminal to the target cell across a space called the synapse. The axon terminal releases neurotransmitter molecules that enable the electrical impulse to conduct across the synaptic cleft. The central nervous system consists of two components: the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is composed of a thin outer layer of gray matter and white matter that comprises the bulk of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is divided into right and left hemispheres, and each hemisphere consists of 4 lobes, each with specific functions. The frontal lobe sits at the front of the cerebrum and is responsible for higher cognitive functions such as planning and reasoning, voluntary motor function, verbal and written expressive language, long-term memory storage, sexual behavior, and emotions. The occipital lobe sits at the posterior portion of the cerebrum and is the primary visual area of the brain. The parietal lobe is located between the frontal and occipital lobes and is responsible for processing information from sensory receptors in the skin and joints, determining shapes and sizes, processing language, and understanding speech. And the temporal lobe is responsible for processing high-order visual information such as facial recognition, speech comprehension, memory formation and retrieval, and hearing. The area indicated in light blue in the image on the left illustrates the motor cortex, which helps to plan, control, and execute voluntary and intentional movement. The dark purple area just posterior to the motor cortex is the somatosensory cortex, which is the area that receives information about temperature, taste, touch, and movement from the rest of the body. In the image on the right, we see some additional brain structures. The cerebellum is the area of the brain involved in balance and coordination and is responsible for interpreting actual movement and correcting any movements that interfere with coordination in the body's position. The brainstem is the area below the spinal cord and cerebrum that controls the necessary life functions including breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. The spinal cord connects the brain with the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The peripheral nervous system has a sensory or afferent division which collects information from the body and transmits it through ascending nerve tracts to the central nervous system for processing. The peripheral nervous system also has a motor or efferent division which returns information from the brain to the body so it can act upon the information. The motor division of the brain is divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls parts of the body that are under voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system, which sounds very similar to automatic nervous system, is responsible for body functions that are not under voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system is further broken down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system prepares the body for activity, and in stressful situations, it initiates the fight or flight response, preparing the individual to take a stand against a threat or to retreat. Conversely, the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for conserving energy and organ maintenance. This is often referred to as the rest and digest response. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system results in diversion of blood from the skin and GI system to the brain, heart, and skeletal muscles, increased mental activity and alertness, increased heart rate, dilation of the bronchial tree to allow increased oxygen exchange, elevated blood glucose availability, and dilation of the pupils for improved vision. Functions of the parasympathetic nervous system include a decrease in heart rate and cardiac contractility, pupillary constriction, increased digestion, bronchoconstriction, energy storage, and activation of the immune system. This table summarizes the differences in the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. EMS providers must have a good understanding of these different responses, so please take a moment to pause the video and review this information. Pain receptors, also called nociceptors, are sensory nerves that respond to damaging or potentially damaging stimuli by sending signals to the central nervous system for processing. Our bodies also have thermoreceptors that respond to heat. Nociceptors and thermoreceptors have similar sensations because their receptors overlap and they use the same pathways within the nervous system. Pain described as acute onset refers to a sudden onset such as pain following an injury. Chronic pain refers to pain that is ongoing over an extended period of time. Neuropathic pain comes from diseases that affect or damage sensory nerves. Sources of neuropathic pain include diabetic neuropathy or shingles. Nociceptive pain arises from tissues that are damaged by physical or chemical agents, including trauma or chemical burns. Nociceptive pain can be divided into two categories, somatic pain and visceral pain. Somatic pain is caused by activation of superficial pain receptors, including the skin, bones, muscles, and joints. Somatic pain tends to be intense and localized or confined to a precise area. Visceral pain is caused by activation of deep pain receptors found in organs in the chest, abdominal, and pelvic cavities. Visceral pain is generalized and often described in more vague terms, such as an ache or pressure. Referred pain is pain that is received in a part of the body away from the actual point of origin. Many experts believe that referred pain happens because of the overlapping of receptors and nerve pathways in the nervous system. An example of referred pain would be pain caused by an angina attack that originates in the heart and causes chest pain, but may also present with referred pain to the left arm, neck, and/or jaw. Gallbladder inflammation is another good example of referred pain that is often felt in the right shoulder area. Phantom pain is clinically defined as the perception of pain or discomfort in a limb that no longer exists. It is seen mostly in patients who have experienced limb amputation. The underlying pathophysiology of phantom pain remains poorly understood. Blood flow to the brain is dependent upon cerebral perfusion pressure, or CPP. Before we go any further, let's define some of the terms seen here. Cerebral perfusion pressure is the pressure of the blood filling the arteries of the brain. Mean arterial pressure, or MAP, is the average arterial pressure during a single cardiac cycle, meaning it is the average blood pressure in the arteries. MAP is an indicator of how well the brain is being supplied with nutrients like oxygen and glucose. Intracranial pressure, or ICP, is the pressure exerted by fluids such as cerebral spinal fluid inside the skull and on the brain tissue. ICP is measured in millimeters of mercury, or mmHg, and is normally between 7 to 15 millimeters of mercury. So cerebral perfusion pressure is calculated as the difference between the mean arterial pressure and the intracranial pressure, or MAP minus ICP. Before we move to calculating the MAP, let's discuss three more terms. The systolic blood pressure, or SBP, is the top number in the blood pressure, and it represents the pressure in the arteries when the heart contracts and pumps blood throughout the body. The diastolic blood pressure, or DBP, is the pressure in the arteries while the heart is at rest and refilling for the next contraction. DBP is the bottom number in the blood pressure. The pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, or SBP minus DBP. A normal pulse pressure is around 40 millimeters of mercury. The mean arterial pressure is calculated by adding the diastolic blood pressure to 1/3 of the pulse pressure. A normal cerebral perfusion pressure runs from 70 to 90 millimeters of mercury, while a normal mean arterial pressure is between 85 and 95 millimeters of mercury. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are attached to the brain and provide input and output from the brain. The cranial nerves are numbered using Roman numerals from 1 to 12 in the order they connect to the brain from the anterior to the posterior. They are primarily responsible for sensory and motor functions of the head and neck, except for the vagus nerve that targets organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. The image on the left illustrates the location of each of these nerves and their function. The spinal cord serves as a conduit for motor and sensory information. Sensory information is transmitted afferently from the body tissue into the spinal cord and up to the brain, while motor information must transmit efferently from the brain and spinal cord out to the peripheral tissue. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves provide the pathway for the transmission of these impulses. The image on the right illustrates the location and function of the spinal nerves. The enlarged image of the vertebra illustrates where the spinal nerve interacts with the spinal cord. I recommend you pause this video here to take a close look at both images. As advanced providers, it's important for us to have a solid understanding of both the cranial and spinal nerves. This brings us to the end of this presentation. Here we see the learning objectives for this module. Can you demonstrate each of these objectives? If not, consider going back to review any content that you struggled with. Thank you for watching this learning segment.